you do closing prayer tonight? Thanks. No. Sunday it's not as bad because I'm actually lecturing, but Wednesday I like to have this more intimate setting. Well, I have to be on camera, so this is as far as I can go according to Mr. Jeremiah. So, what? Well, you guys should. I thought you were saying I was like, if you want to, I can move. Yeah, you guys are welcome to move forward too, not just doesn't matter what I sit in front row. Sorry, those are my families. Oh, yeah, kind of. Play with them to keep Jenny from getting into trouble. No, we put you might have noticed back there, but it's to keep stuff from falling through the slats when she drops off. Hi, Andrea. Some stuff. That's true. Some stuff does still get through. She does that. All right. We decided we'd get started a little late. Just give people time to trickle in.
Add Michelle to your prayer list. She's had hives for like the last 3 days. Not going away.
Yikes.
What did she get into? She thinks corn chips, but she hasn't eaten them for days, and the hives are they're not getting any better, and she's been taking hydroxyl. And so I'm like, I don't know, unless she's been eating other gluten stuff, I'm thinking it might be gluten. She's gonna go see Dr. Lyman tomorrow.
Fine. All right, well that clock just hit 5, as in 6:25, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. We'll start with a couple songs. You're stuck with me for song leading tonight. And then Jeremiah will have our opening prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Let's open up to 71. That's number 71 in our songbooks. And Audrey, I don't think you've seen me. Oh, you've seen me song lead before, right? I know. But I'll apologize in advance because I'm not a good song leader. But 71.
Anybody who's willing to do it is good.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. So. All right, 71, As the Deer. We'll sing both. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. I want you more than gold or silver, only you can satisfy. You alone are the real joy giver and the apple of my eye. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. All right, our next song before our prayer is 674. 674. Actually sang this tonight. Audrey was baptized, so it's a cool song. And we'll do the first, second, and fourth tonight. It's the first, second, and fourth. That's 674. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back.
Let us pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we've had to worship you, to be able to go into this time to study your word, to hear a lesson from David. Be with Dina's mom's husband Zeke as he's having to stop his cancer treatments. Help him to have the ease of pain. Be with Stacy Armstrong's dad as he's going into the final stages of his life, and help him and that family as he'll pass on soon. Especially with Stacy as she's struggling with this, Lord. Be with all those that are traveling during this upcoming weekend, especially be with Dean and Sandy tonight as they're traveling, and Elaine as she's down in Texas. Give her a safe trip home. And be with Michelle and help her with her hives that she has. Help them to be able to figure out what's causing them. In Christ's name, pray. Amen.
Switching microphones here because Jeremiah tells me this one's better quality for the stream. So let's open up to Galatians. As we're making our way into this book. It's Galatians chapter 1, and we'll be in verses 6 through 10 tonight. Short section that we'll be dealing with, but a good one. So here, as we briefly studied last week, here in Galatians chapter 1, the book opens in verses 1 through 5 with, among other things, Paul reminding his readers of his apostleship and reminding them that he's not sent by the authority of man, but with the authority of Jesus behind him, that the text says God raised from the dead. Now, following that, Paul, he doesn't waste any time in writing this letter. Right beginning in verse 6, he gets right at the heart of the issue of what's going on here in Galatians. Now, according to what we read in verse 6 of this chapter that we'll read in a moment, the heart of the issue as to why Paul writes this letter is because the Galatian Christians, they seem to be abandoning the teachings that they had received from Paul, from others who preach the gospel and pursuing what verse 6 calls a different gospel. So there in verse 6 he says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. Now, according to that verse, what are the Galatians doing? A different gospel, different belief. What else is this verse telling us? What's Paul's attitude towards this, according to this verse? He's amazed. So what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to be amazed? Exactly, that's his attitude, is like, what's going on? What's wrong with you guys? Well, what other word do we see here? He says, I'm amazed that, or wrong question, sorry. He says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ. What does that word quickly mean? When something is happening quickly, what does that mean? Fast. So, they're doing this quickly, the text says. And so what seems to be implied there, among other things, is that they're not quickly, but fast, rapidly, whatever word you want to plug in there. It seems that there's a short time frame from the time they receive the gospel to the time that they're beginning to abandon what they had learned from Paul as far as the gospel is concerned. But we also notice here that the text says that they're abandoning this, sorry, I'm jumbling my words here. He says, I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you. Now, what does it mean when we're called by God? That's another way to put that. We've talked about this word before. An invitation, that's exactly what it means. If God calls you into this relationship with Jesus, he's inviting you. But according to the language of this verse, why does God do that? What attribute of God, or of Jesus in this case, causes him to do that? Grace. And what is grace? I know you guys know this. Go ahead. Gift, unmerited favor. So, yes, that is. So it's by God's grace, but in this case, the grace of Christ, through Jesus' grace. And so, Paul is amazed at the fact that these Christians were rapidly abandoning God that invited them into a relationship with him through Jesus' grace. And what are they abandoning it for? What's that last phrase in the text in verse 6? That's it. For a different gospel. Can anyone, Jeremiah, do you have your hand up?
It's the same thing that he talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 4, when he wrote to the Corinthians, that the Judaizers were sitting there forcing Old Testament law and circumcision back upon the new Christians.
Yeah.
Like they're forcing an issue that hasn't been, because it's not required.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, just before we leave this verse, what does the word gospel mean? Good news. Good news. So Paul is using this language because, yes, there's these people who are bringing in teachings and calling it gospel, calling it good news. And so that's why Paul uses this language of a different gospel. And so, with this being true, in verses 6 through 10, Paul deals with the issue of the Galatians abandoning God and Jesus for this different gospel. And he makes 2 points as to why this is a problem, to abandon the true gospel for this different gospel. First point Paul will make in verse 7 as to why this is a problem is because a different gospel is a distorted gospel. And we'll talk about that. The second point Paul will make as to why this is a problem in verses 6 through 9 is because a different gospel is a cursed gospel. And he'll conclude this in verse 10 where he reminds the Galatian Christians that in his preaching of the gospel, he is not seeking to please men, but is rather seeking to serve Jesus. And so what we'll learn from this, the application from it, is that we must hold to the true gospel that we have received, that's revealed in the New Testament, realizing that if we abandon that gospel, abandon what's revealed in the New Testament, we put our souls and our eternity at risk. So that in mind, we'll go ahead and read verses 7 through 10, and then we'll look at the points. So we already read verse 6, and then the thought continues into verse 7, where he says, which is for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. So again, the first point we're going to look at here in verse 7 is that a different gospel is a distorted gospel. So he begins there by saying, on that hinges of that different gospel, he says it's really not another. What does he mean by that when he says this different gospel is really not another? What does the word gospel mean? Another good. There's not going to be another good news. So these false teachers that Jeremiah alluded to are coming in. They're calling it gospel, but Paul's saying, no, it is not good news. And from the context, we'll see that the reason a different form of this gospel, of this good news, is not good news is because this different good news changes the true good news. And I'll explain that a little bit more here as we get further into this verse. Questions or comments on that before we get into the rest of verse 7? Okay. So since that's true, since a different gospel is no gospel at all, Paul goes on to address the fact that there were people who were disturbing, the New American Standard says, the Galatian Christians and are desiring to distort the gospel of Christ. Now, what does it mean to distort something? Let's start with that. To change it. To alter it. To twist it around. So what are these people who are coming in doing? The text says they're disturbing them. What does it mean? What do you think it means when it says they're disturbing them?
Greek word means to shake back and forth. So to twist, that it works really hand in hand. If that word means to twist.
All right.
If distort means to twist, it would be perfect terms to match each other. They're causing emotional pain and they're trying to stir up and turn it back and forth.
That's it. So they're causing trouble and doing that shaking back and forth. And so part of the picture that's being painted here is these Galatian Christians they're not very mature Christians. Maybe that's the wrong word. But they're new to the faith. They're young Christians. And so they've received one set of teachings, but now there's these people coming behind Paul and giving them a whole new set of teachings. It's these people Jeremiah called the Judaizers. These are, when you read Acts 15, you find these are Jewish Christians. They're Christians, but they're Jews. But what these Jewish Christians are attempting to do is put Old Testament teachings on these non-Jewish Christians. That's a problem. Because among other things, Jesus defeated the old law on the cross, brought it to an end. And so these Judaizers come in and say, yeah, it's fine to believe in Jesus, by all means. But you also have to do these other things that are revealed in the Old Testament law. And that's why they're called Judaizers. I mentioned last week, you won't find that term in any Bible text. But this is a term that people have applied to these Jewish Christians who are putting Old Testament laws on the Gentile, non-Jewish Christians. And so, bringing that to this verse that we're looking at, these people were disturbing, causing trouble for the Galatian Christians. But Paul says here that in doing these things, in putting these Old Testament laws, these Judaizers were distorting the gospel.
And in their defense, a little bit, hard for them to give up these rituals and traditions that they've done for hundreds, thousand years. And so they're having a hard time letting go of it.
That's true. Some of these Jews, they do have a hard time letting go of those teachings. But as we're already saying, this doesn't justify trying to put those Old Testament laws on these Gentile Christians. I don't want to go too far off on this, but it's pertinent to the point. It is true that a lot of these Jewish Christians would bring what I'm calling baggage, religious baggage, into their Christianity. Now, for the Jew, if they want to continue to observe some of those things, that's fine. It's an issue of conscience, and it's something that Paul deals heavily with in Romans 14, which I'll talk to you about when I get there on Sunday mornings. But to put that on a Gentile who is never required to observe those Jewish laws, that's a problem. Because God never at any point would require a Gentile to observe those laws, unless that Gentile chose to convert to Judaism. That's the only exception. So that's what Paul is dealing with here. And what makes it worse is that these Galatians are falling victim to it. And Paul's saying, no, you can't allow this to happen. You can't abandon what you've learned for this quote-unquote different gospel, which Paul says is no gospel at all. You're totally defeating that relationship that you've come into. And that's why he says in verse 6 that you're deserting Christ. You're deserting Jesus. You're deserting God in embracing these teachings that God never wanted you to embrace. And so putting all that together, the point we should see here is that a different gospel is a distorted gospel. Now, the point Paul makes in this verse teaches us that if we add things to the gospel message, we're twisting it around. You're adding things that weren't meant to be there. And so if we add or even take away things from the gospel, you completely change it. And as a result, when we change the gospel, when we change these teachings, that different gospel, as Paul puts it, is really not another. Now, why is that true? Why is it that if you go to a different gospel, it's really not another? In other words, if you change the good news, why is it not good news anymore? It's not true. Nothing needs to be changed. Now, this is probably a lame illustration, but I'm going to use it anyway. You have a recipe. A recipe calls for this, this, and this. You add something to it, you take something away from it, it's not the original recipe anymore. Now, applying that here, you change the gospel, it's not the gospel anymore. You've put something into it, you've taken something away from it that was never meant to be added or taken away. Therefore, a different gospel is really not another. I've hammered that out a lot, more than I intended to, but any questions or comments on any of that before we go to verses 8 and 9?
Let's just make a cherry cobbler with peaches.
There you go.
No longer a cherry cobbler, it's a peach cobbler.
It's a peach cobbler, yeah.
But you're still calling it a cherry cobbler, so
Yeah.
that's like they were doing.
Exactly. So, any other questions or comments on verse 7? All right. Let's go to verses 8 and 9, the second point. Again, the point we'll look at here is that different gospel is a cursed gospel. So Paul says in verse 8, I'll just read it again. He says, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed." What do you hear Paul saying there?
Well, that's a very serious thing.
It's a very serious thing.
Teaching lies, untruths.
Okay, that's an application of it. But what do you hear Paul saying in the text?
If anyone or any being comes and preaches something different than what we've already told you is the truth, that being should be cursed.
Now, what do you think that word means, accursed? Jeremiah, you look like you have it on the tip of your tongue.
I do know what it means, but it's unusual because that word is binding and condemning you to hell, and you have no chance of ever getting out of it. I mean, so to me, it's the only time in the Bible that it's telling you, once you've done this, you are condemned to hell for all eternity. You're eternally in hell. You have no chance of getting out of it. It's really weird because I've never, so just looking at it when I was studying this last week, it's the only time. And I never, like I said, I never noticed it, but it is the only technically unpardonable sin. It means you're condemned to hell. You can't get out. You can't get out.
It's really that blunt. This word accursed, it comes from, first of all, I want to point out that it comes from the same word that we get our English word anathema. Now, that's a fancy word. Can anyone tell me what anathema means? Like I said, it's a fancy word, but it is the idea of being cursed. It's a word that refers to something intensely hated and as a result condemned. But going back to Jeremiah's comments, Paul uses this word to say that if you leave the gospel for a different gospel, you're done. There's no hope for you. You are accursed. You're subject to God's wrath if you abandon the gospel message and go to a different gospel, which Paul has already said is no gospel at all. So, let me ask this question with all that in mind. If you leave Jesus, leave this gospel, why are you cursed? Why are you in this position of being accursed if you abandon the true gospel? That's it. And that's the circumstance of these Galatians. They know the gospel. They know the truth. But they're allowing themselves to fall victim to these false teachings that are coming in.
I kind of took this to be more of against the false teachers, just like we know we taught before, that you've been appointed to be kind of the shepherd of the church and you lead people astray. You're going to be held accountable for those souls that you led astray. And that's how I kind of took this. Those false teachers were going to be really in big trouble for leading these souls the wrong way.
Yeah, and that's also true. Jeremiah, do you have your hand
So
up?
I was going to say, it says here, if you reread the whole thing, he is to be accursed, and it's referring back to the false teacher, not the
Yeah.
individual who steps away as a
Yeah. Yeah, and that's also true. This text is talking about the one who's teaching, but by extension, if somebody does embrace those teachings, they're also cursed. But you're right. This is talking about the false teachers themselves. But going back to my original question, if you abandon that true gospel, you're cursed because Jesus is the only way to salvation. So you abandon Jesus, there's no other way to be saved. It's really that simple. But yes, coming back into the text, Paul is saying here that if anyone comes preaching this different gospel, that teacher is doomed to destruction, is the language I'm using. And it's because of that word, accursed. But notice the examples he uses here. If we, Paul, his companions, or an angel, a messenger from heaven, anybody with any kind of authority behind them, if they're preaching a different gospel, they're accursed.
Which also means to me that we personally better know what the true gospel is.
Yeah.
And the only way we can know that is to study it.
Absolutely.
Because we could easily be led astray.
We could easily be led astray. So yes, we need to study it. Any other questions or comments on verse 8 before we get into verse 9, which makes a similar point? Okay. So coming into verse 9, Paul emphasizes the point of verse 8 and repeats a similar point. He says, as we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. So, we find the term accursed again from verse 8, and here Paul is again emphasizing that the person is condemned by God if they preach a gospel contrary to the one received by the Galatian Christians. So at first glance, this seems, well, Paul's saying the same thing. But what are some differences between verse 9 and verse 8? Can you see any? Okay. Okay, absolutely. If any man is preaching, and that's one difference. As we know from the context of the book, people are presently preaching this different gospel to the churches in Galatia, these Judaizers. What are some other differences between verse 9 and verse 8?
One's a hypothetical, one is real.
So you're saying verse 8 is hypothetical, verse 9 is real.
They don't have angels anymore coming down.
Okay.
It's hypothetical if an angel comes, if they did, which they wouldn't. But in verse 9, it truly is happening. So one is hypothetical, one is real.
Okay. Okay, absolutely. Hypothetical versus real. What are some other observations as far as differences?
Starts out saying, as we have said before, so I say again now.
And what does that mean?
So some other, at first I was thinking it was referring to just the previous verse.
Mm-hmm.
But then, maybe someone also taught it in another tongue.
That has to be the case. That it's not just referring back to verse 8, but Paul's basically telling them, I've told you this before. Which is another reason we could say he's amazed. They already knew this. Part of teaching the gospel is pointing out that these other different gospels are not the gospel. Sometimes you have to do that. So Paul is saying, I've told you this before. You already know this. You already know what I said in verse 8. So that's one of the primary differences between verse 9 and verse 8. Paul is repeating a point that they were already aware of. And so, again, this is why Paul's amazed. This is why he's saying this is a problem. Because you guys should know better. You already know that these things are wrong. Now, and part of the reason for that is because these are things that were addressed in Acts chapter 15 that Paul will refer back to in chapter 2 of Galatians. So these are things that were already dealt with. And so there was absolutely no reason, no logical reason, that these Galatian Christians should accept this different gospel. Questions or comments on any of that before we tie up the point? Okay. So putting verses 8 and 9 together, the point we should see from these verses is that a different gospel is a cursed gospel. Now, in these verses, Paul has shown that a person who preaches this different gospel, that person is eternally condemned by God. They're leading people astray. And so as a result of this, the different gospel itself is a cursed gospel. Because a different gospel, it doesn't bring people to God and to Jesus. It leads them away from God and from Jesus. And if you're led away from God and Jesus, you're condemned. And since that's true, Paul teaches that no matter who it is, a man, an angel, if anyone is preaching a gospel that does not line up with the gospel that is revealed by Paul and other New Testament readers and ultimately by Jesus, then that person is cursed by God and subject to God's wrath. This brings us into verse 10 where Paul says, "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." What do you hear Paul saying there in these questions that he asked? That could be part of it. Yeah, that could be part of it, that not everybody's going to like what he has to say. Anyone else? Jeremiah?
So when he was Saul of Tarsus, he did his goal. He tried to have favor of man.
Yeah.
The whole time. He did what the Sanhedrin wanted or what was expected by men to make them happy. He didn't. And so it's polar opposite. And this whole verse is him defending his ministry and his faith because he's being challenged. And
Yeah.
the rest of Galatians is him defending his faith, really, and his apostleship.
Yeah.
So it's showing a contrast. If he was trying to do this, he wouldn't be a bondservant, like he says at the end. A bondservant is involuntarily a slave for life. It's a Greek word.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what that word bondservant means, a slave. So, yes, what he says here not only serves as a conclusion to what he just said, but it also serves to introduce what he's about to say, because part of his writing Galatians, Jeremiah pointed out, is he has to defend his character. But the question comes up, why does he have to do that? So at this point in the discussion, Paul is asking these two questions, followed by an answer for the purpose of making the point that in his preaching of the gospel, he's not seeking to win favor with people, but instead he is seeking to serve Jesus. Now again, one possible reason that Paul asks these questions is because the false teachers that have made their way into the Galatian churches, they might be accusing Paul of being a man-pleaser. Paul, you're preaching a gospel that says there's nothing we can do to earn salvation. But some of these Jews that had that law mindset said, well, I have to be involved in my salvation. But Paul says that's not what the gospel is about. The gospel is what God has done for us through Jesus. Now, yes, there's things we have to do in response to that, but at the end of the day, none of those things that we do matter if Jesus is not in the equation. And you've heard me say that before. And so Paul answers these questions by saying that if he were still trying to please men, he would not be a bondservant, a slave of Jesus. And so, since that's true, here Paul is saying that if he were seeking to be a man-pleaser, he would not be seeking to be pleasing to Jesus. And so as a result of that, we can also assume that the reason Paul says these things is because Paul understands that we can only serve one of two masters, Jesus or man. Go ahead.
Paul's also certainly not been a pleaser of men. He's been persecuted by them, harassed. So reminding them too that I'm sticking with Jesus. I'm standing up for my faith and following Jesus and paying the price for it.
Absolutely. Any other questions or comments on verse 10? Okay. So when we put everything that Paul has said in verses 6 through 10 together, the point we should see from verse 6 through 10 is that the Galatians were abandoning the true gospel for a different gospel. But Paul tells them you can't do that. Why? Because a different gospel is a distorted gospel, and a different gospel is a cursed gospel. And so what we learned from these verses is that we have to hold to the gospel that is revealed to us through what we read in the pages of the New Testament, through Jesus and through Paul and others, gospel preachers. But why? Because it's only that gospel, the gospel that we read here, it's the only one that can save us. And so any other gospel that someone might preach, it doesn't save, because it distorts the message of the true gospel and curses anyone who preaches it and anyone who accepts it. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that we are not deserting Jesus. You desert the gospel, you desert Jesus. And that results in losing the salvation that comes through this one and only gospel that is revealed by Jesus, Paul, and other New Testament writers. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, we'll close with that, and Matt, if you can close us in prayer.
Forgot to mention, I talked briefly with Dane. Surgery's all done, but he's been in a lot of pain, and it's slowly getting better, but it's been a lot harder on him. I think he forgot he's getting older too, and so pray that he has.
How long is he going to be there?
I didn't get a chance to really ask that. I don't know. I'm thinking they're working on that, but he had planned to go home by himself, not to. Now he's rethinking that he doesn't really have an option. He doesn't want to go into a rehab facility. So I don't know what they're going to do.
Let's pray. Dear God, our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this time we've had to come together and study your word. We're thankful for Dave and his efforts, and we're thankful for your word, and hope, Father, that we can always be true and faithful to it. Be with us now as we leave here, and keep us safe. In Christ's name we pray.